Daniel Defoe's birth date is not known exactly, but it's believed to be about 1660. He was born in London, and he died in London in 1731 at the age of about 71. He's best known for having written Robinson Crusoe, a novel that, if you ask me, is a warning that if you don't listen to your father, you'll end up marooned on a deserted island. Daniel Defoe's birth name was Daniel Foe. He later added the aristocratic-sounding duh. His family were English dissenters, or English separatists. These are Protestants who had separated from the Church of England in the 17th and 18th centuries. They opposed state interference in religious matters and had their own communities, schools, and churches. Daniel Defoe, or Daniel Foe, married a woman named Mary Tuffley. They were married for 47 years, and they had 8 children. In 1685, apparently when he was only 24 or 25 years old, he joined what is now called the Monmouth Rebellion, which was a push against the king, James II, and he was pardoned for that later. In 1689, William III was crowned, and Defoe became one of his close allies and a secret agent. He worked both as a political propagandist trying to influence public opinion, but also apparently reported back to the king and tried to assess public opinion as well. It's hard to find details on what he did, though it's also known that he used 198 pen names. And of course, using pen names by itself was not too unusual, but that's a pretty high number of pen names. It's possible that sometimes he wanted to look like more than one person. Scholars also have a hard time now knowing exactly how many things Defoe wrote because of all of his pen names. There's a story about him having been pilloried, that's put in the stocks for a few days, when the political winds changed and were blowing against him, though the details of it are not totally clear and subject to some debate. Today we're going to be looking at a journal of the plague year, which was published in 1722, and it is a book about the plague in London of 1665 and 1666. The exact death toll is not known, but it's believed that the plague killed about 100,000 people, which is about a quarter of the population of London at the time, in 18 months. And that is the same number that is given in this text that we're going to look at, and it's also the historical number that people think is accurate today. This plague is the event that made Isaac Newton leave London for a couple years and develop his laws of gravity and optics and essentially invent calculus. So while we're going over all these terrible things that are happening in London during this period, you can remember that Isaac Newton has safely taken refuge at Woolsthorpe Manor in Lincolnshire, where he is developing derivatives and integrals. Separately, in 1666, there was also a big fire in London as the plague was ending that destroyed 436 acres of the city. And then another 40 years or so later, in 1703, there was a big storm that destroyed 2,000 chimneys and 4,000 oaks from a forest that they had planted. And it's estimated that over 1,000 sailors drowned. So this was a rough period for London. But today we're really just going to be looking at the plague. It's worth it to talk a little bit about this text first. It's undersigned with the initials HF. Daniel Foe had an uncle named Henry Foe who was in London during the plague and kept a journal. So it's generally thought that his journal is the primary source for this book. Henry Foe was, like the narrator, a saddler, a guy who makes saddles, and he lived in Whitechapel, which is in East London. But it's generally accepted that Daniel Foe supplemented the journal with some other research, though it's not clear exactly how much. And there's debate as to whether this book should be thought of as a history or as a historical novel. And people tend to have pretty strong opinions about this. Some people say, no, there's nothing in it that couldn't be thought of as history. It's a very good documentation of the events, and it can be compared with other diaries from the time. For example, that of Samuel Pepys or the Loimologia, and they say that if anything is invented, it's small and unimportant details. Some other people say that it's better to think of it as a historical novel. For our purposes, whether the precise details of, for example, the weekly deaths are taken from London government records or estimated by Daniel Defoe after the fact is not that important. What we can get from this is a portrait of this moment in the history of London and of England, and the descriptions of the scenes and the events and how people were reacting and what was happening, whether it's from Henry Defoe's journal, as much of it might well be, or from reports that Daniel Defoe found after the fact. Since other people who have studied this event from other sources have commented that this is a good description of it, we can take these descriptions as representing what happened. And so when we think of this event, if we think of the details described in this book, we will be likely remembering it pretty close to how it happened. And now we can get into some passages from this book by Daniel Defoe. And to avoid pushing you in one way or another in thinking about this text, rather than saying Daniel Defoe writes or saying Henry Defoe writes, because we don't know the exact origin of any given sentence, I'm just going to say the narrator, because it's all told in the first person. And if Henry Defoe wrote a certain sentence, it would be wrong to say Daniel Defoe wrote it. And if Daniel Defoe wrote it, it would be wrong to say that Henry had written it. The narrator initially describes the rumors that are spreading about a sickness on the European continent. The narrator writes, quote, "We had no such thing as printed newspapers in those days to spread rumors and reports of things, and to improve them by the invention of men, as I have lived to see practiced since. But such things as these were gathered from the letters of merchants and others who corresponded abroad, and from them was handed about by word of mouth only, so that things did not spread instantly over the whole nation, as they do now. But it seems that the government had a true account of it, and several councils were held about ways to prevent its coming over, but all was kept very private. Hence it was that this rumor died off again, and people began to forget it as a thing we were very little concerned in, and that we hoped was not true." End quote. And one of the first things that happens is that once it becomes clear that the sickness is real and it has arrived in London and is spreading quickly, the wealthier people who have somewhere to retreat to get out of the city. In this passage, he also describes people trying to get permits from the mayor in order to leave, and people are all crowded around the mayor's office to get these health permits. The narrator writes, quote, "The richer sort of people, especially the nobility and gentry from the west part of the city, thronged out of town with their families and servants in an unusual manner, and this was more particularly seen in Whitechapel, that is to say, the Broad Street where I lived. Indeed, nothing was to be seen but wagons and carts with goods, women, servants, children, and coaches filled with people of the better sort and horsemen attending them, and all hurrying away. Then empty wagons and carts appeared, and spare horses with servants who, it was apparent, were returning or sent from the countries to fetch more people. Besides, innumerable numbers of men on horseback, some alone, others with servants, and generally speaking all loaded with baggage and fitted out for traveling, as anyone might perceive by their appearance. This was a very terrible and melancholy thing to see, and as it was a sight which I could not but look on from morning to night, for indeed there was nothing else of moment to be seen, it filled me with very serious thoughts of the misery that was coming upon the city, and the unhappy condition of those that would be left in it. This hurry of the people was such for some weeks that there was no getting at the Lord Mayor's door without exceeding difficulty. There was such pressing and crowding there to get passes and certificates of health for such as traveled abroad, for without these there was no being admitted to pass through the towns upon the road, or to lodge in any inn. Now as there had none died in the city for all this time, my Lord Mayor gave certificates of health without any difficulty to all those who lived in the 97 parishes, and to those within the liberties too for a while." End quote. In the next passage, the narrator is trying to figure out what he should do, and he's considering what he has to think of. For example, he has his business, and he has a storehouse with some stuff in it, and he's worked hard on it, and he doesn't want to lose all his stuff. But also the plague is very serious, and so he's trying to decide what to do. He writes, quote, "I had two important things before me. The one was the carrying on my business and shop, which was considerable, and in which was embarked all my effects in the world, and the other was the preservation of my life in so dismal a calamity as I saw apparently was coming upon the whole city, and which, however great it was, my fears perhaps, as well as other people's, represented to be much greater than it could be. The first consideration was of great moment to me. My trade was a saddler, and as my dealings were chiefly not by a shop or chance trade, but among the merchants trading to the English colonies in America, so my effects lay very much in the hands of such. I was a single man, 'tis true, but I had a family of servants whom I kept at my business, had a house, shop, and warehouses filled with goods, and in short, to leave them all as things in such a case must be left, that is to say, without any overseer or person fit to be trusted with them, had been to hazard the loss not only of my trade, but of my goods, and indeed of all I had in the world." End quote. And he's trying to decide what to do, and he's thinking about whether it's God's will that there be a plague, and if it is, maybe there's no point in resisting it. It's just up to God whether he's going to survive or not. And he talks to his brother about this, and his brother gives the example of, he says, the Turks and the Mohammedans in Asia. And of course, he means Muslims when he says Mohammedans. And in this book and other books, they sometimes use Turk interchangeably with Muslim. They may not specify that they're talking about Muslims. They just say the Turks do such and such, and what they mean is that Muslims do such and such. The narrator writes of what his brother says, quote, "Then he proceeded to tell me of the mischievous consequences which attended the presumption of the Turks and Mohammedans in Asia and in other places where he had been. For my brother, being a merchant, was a few years before, as I have already observed, returned from abroad, coming last from Lisbon, and how, presuming upon their professed predestinating notions, and of every man's end being predetermined and unalterably beforehand decreed, they would go unconcerned into infected places and converse with infected persons, by which means they died at the rate of 10 or 15,000 a week, whereas the Europeans or Christian merchants, who kept themselves retired and reserved, generally escaped the contagion." End quote. This is a mode of thinking that remains observable in many Muslims today. You might call it fatalism, you might call it determinism, but though Islam and Christianity apparently teach to a similar degree that nothing happens without God's permission, that everything is under God's power and whatever happens, it's because God willed it to happen. Even today, Muslims will express this belief more often than Christians will generally. Obviously not in every single case, but if you grew up in a Christian culture and you encounter Muslims and you talk to them for a while, you'll notice that they're a little bit more likely to say things like this. Not that you ought to wander into a crowd of sick people and leave it up to God if you're going to get sick or not, but the idea that we don't have as much control over things as we think we do, and really it's up to God. We need not worry about it so much. We can just trust him. And whether this was written by Henry Foe or Daniel Defoe, this thought having been expressed, whether it was in 1666 when Henry was writing or around 1722 when Daniel was writing, shows that this thought was in the air. At that time, also, some Europeans were aware of this mode of thinking among Muslims and, as they say it, Turks, which perhaps is not too surprising. But without such a little data point, you might more easily be able to say, well, maybe this was a 20th century theological trend in Islam. For whatever reason, they developed that way of thinking later. No, at least 300 years ago, this thought and this difference in behavior, even if it was exaggerated, even if it was a little bit rumored, it came from noticing some difference in behavior and speech. So it's at least that old, and probably much older. In the next passage, he's describing how the whole city changes, how everything looks different. And he says that London, that the city itself might well be said to be all in tears. The city is crying. It's so affected by this terrible thing that's happened to it. He writes, quote, "The face of London was now indeed strangely altered. I mean the whole mass of buildings, city, liberties, suburbs, Westminster, Southwark, and all together. For as to the particular part called the city, or within the walls, that was not yet much infected. But in the whole, the face of things, I say, was much altered. Sorrow and sadness sat upon every face, and though some parts were not yet overwhelmed, yet all looked deeply concerned. And as we saw it apparently coming on, so everyone looked on himself and his family as in the utmost danger. Were it possible to represent those times exactly to those that did not see them, and give the reader due ideas of the horror that everywhere presented itself, it must make just impressions upon their minds and fill them with surprise. London might well be said to be all in tears. The mourners did not go about the streets indeed, for nobody put on black or made a formal dress of mourning for their nearest friends, but the voice of mourners was truly heard in the streets. The shrieks of women and children at the windows and doors of their houses, where their dearest relations were perhaps dying or just dead, were so frequent to be heard as we passed the streets that it was enough to pierce the stoutest heart in the world to hear them. Tears and lamentations were seen almost in every house, especially in the first part of the visitation, for towards the latter end men's hearts were hardened, and death was so always before their eyes that they did not so much concern themselves for the loss of their friends, expecting that themselves should be summoned the next hour." End quote. In the next section, he's talking about how empty the streets are, and how he can go a long way without seeing anybody. He writes, quote, "Business led me out sometimes to the other end of the town, even when the sickness was chiefly there, and as the thing was new to me, as well as to everybody else, it was a most surprising thing to see those streets which were usually so thronged, now grown desolate, and so few people to be seen in them, that if I had been a stranger, and at a loss for my way, I might sometimes have gone the length of a whole street, I mean of the by-streets, and seen nobody to direct me except watchmen set at the doors of such houses as were shut up, of which I shall speak presently." End quote. These next few passages deal with something that I'm always very interested in, which is what Charles Mackay, a 19th century Scottish journalist, would call extraordinary popular delusions and the madness of crowds. 150 years after this plague, he wrote a book roughly with that title. It's got a few more words, that catalogs the wild trends that have spread through people at different points in history. It's a very nice, funny book with a lot of interesting history in it. I hope to print an edition of it someday. But interestingly enough, he does not give this example in it. He does not give the example of all the extraordinary popular delusions that accompanied the plague of London in 1666, and these would have fit very nicely into that book. I think if he'd thought of it, he definitely would have put these in there as another niche in the Museum of Human Folly, as he says it. And he mentions in passing Friar Bacon, which is a reference to Roger Bacon, an important name in the history of knowledge and of science, who in the 13th century was one of the first Europeans to try to apply what came to be called an empirical method, that is, an experimental method of science that was derived from work by Ibn al-Haytham, who is an Arab scientist from earlier who'd done some work on optics and tried to demonstrate what he knew by experiments. These are both very early examples of this, long before Galileo. So Roger Bacon is definitely a name worth knowing. And he also mentions his brazen head. And Roger Bacon's brazen head is probably a kind of mythological thing, but he's thought to have had some, we might today say, robotic head. Not his own head, but he had something in his laboratory, or what we would today call a laboratory, that was somehow a head, a mechanical head that could move on its own. Or some descriptions say that it could answer questions, but only if they were put to it so that it could answer yes or no. But he references that in passing, and if you don't know that background, you don't know what he's talking about. He writes, quote, "These terrors and apprehensions of the people led them into 1,000 weak, foolish, and wicked things, which they wanted not a sort of people really wicked to encourage them to. And this was running about to fortune tellers, cunning men, and astrologers to know their fortune, or, as it is vulgarly expressed, to have their fortunes told them, their nativities calculated, and the like. And this folly presently made the town swarm with a wicked generation of pretenders to magic, to the black art, as they called it, and I know not what, nay, to 1,000 worse dealings with the devil than they were really guilty of. And this trade grew so open and so generally practiced that it became common to have signs and inscriptions set up at doors. Here lives a fortune teller. Here lives an astrologer. Here you may have your nativity calculated, and the like. And Friar Bacon's brazen head, which was the usual sign of these people's dwellings, was to be seen almost in every street, or else the sign of Mother Shipton, or of Merlin's head, and the like." End quote. This next passage talks about how the entertainment that had started to spread at the time, the various puppet shows and dancing houses and different things, all shut down or were shut down. He doesn't explicitly say that the government shut them down, but he says they were forbid to act. They were forbidden. But then he also says that the ordinary people were not interested in them because they were thinking about the plague. It's also interesting that he says that these things were an imitation of the French court. They had spread from the French court and they were debauching the manners of the people. So either Henry or Daniel or both didn't like the spread of these things. And it's interesting that they identify them as coming from France. Not that French people brought them, but they were an imitation of things that were in France first. He writes, quote, "All the plays and interludes which after the manner of the French court had been set up and began to increase among us were forbid to act. The gaming tables, public dancing rooms, and music houses, which multiplied and began to debauch the manners of the people, were shut up and suppressed, and the jack puddings, merry andrews, puppet shows, rope dancers, and such like doings, which had bewitched the poor common people, shut up their shops, finding indeed no trade, for the minds of the people were agitated with other things, and a kind of sadness and horror at these things sat upon the countenances even of the common people. Death was before their eyes, and everybody began to think of their graves, not of mirth and diversions." This next section talks not only about fortune tellers and people purporting to do supernatural things, but people selling medicines and cures for the infection that are really just nothing and maybe are even harmful to the people who take them. Quote, "But even those wholesome reflections, which rightly managed would have most happily led the people to fall upon their knees, make confession of their sins, and look up to their merciful Savior for pardon, imploring his compassion on them in such a time of their distress, by which we might have been as a second Nineveh, had a quite contrary extreme in the common people, who, ignorant and stupid in their reflections, as they were brutishly wicked and thoughtless before, were now led by their fright to extremes of folly. And as I have said before, that they ran to conjurers and witches and all sorts of deceivers to know what should become of them, who fed their fears and kept them always alarmed and awake on purpose to delude them and pick their pockets. So they were as mad upon their running after quacks and mountebanks and every practicing old woman for medicines and remedies, storing themselves with such multitudes of pills, potions, and preservatives, as they were called, that they not only spent their money, but even poisoned themselves beforehand for fear of the poison of the infection, and prepared their bodies for the plague instead of preserving them against it. On the other hand, it is incredible and scarce to be imagined how the posts of houses and corners of streets were plastered over with doctors' bills and papers of ignorant fellows, quacking and tampering in physic and inviting the people to come to them for remedies, which was generally set off with such flourishes as these: infallible preventive pills against the plague, never-failing preservatives against the infection, sovereign cordials against the corruption of the air, exact regulations for the conduct of the body in case of an infection, anti-pestilential pills, incomparable drink against the plague never found out before, a universal remedy for the plague, the only true plague water, the royal antidote against all kinds of infection, and such a number more that I cannot reckon up, and if I could, would fill a book of themselves to set them down." End quote. One of the things that's a pretty big part of the policy of the city is the practice of shutting people up in their houses. And the narrator describes how this was first done in a plague in the city in 1603 under King James I. And the authority to do this was granted by an act of parliament. And the mayor of London in 1665 used that law to apply this policy of shutting people up in their houses. And this was controversial because what it essentially was that the government had the authority to imprison people in their houses, to make it so that they couldn't leave. And this was not so that nobody could leave. It wasn't like the whole city, everybody had to stay in their houses. But if you were found to have been infected, or somebody in your house was and you were therefore exposed to it, then you had to stay in your house, or there could be an order to make you stay in your house. And a guard, a watchman, would be put outside your house to make sure you didn't leave. Now, this was problematic for a few reasons. One is that the narrator describes how it was often done maliciously. Somebody would say, oh, this person is infected, they need to be shut up in their house. But really that person just had a grudge against the other person and they were getting revenge on them or something. And the other problem was this meant that let's say that one person is definitely infected in the family and they don't know that the other people have it yet. They might because they've been in the presence of this person who definitely has the plague. And so then they are shut up with them, which means that if they didn't have it before, they definitely will get it now because now they're locked up with the person who definitely has it. So on the one hand, while it may have stopped the sickness from spreading, it also may have killed people who otherwise may not have died if they'd been able to leave their house. And the narrator goes over all of this in detail. Another issue is that people would often try to either sneak past their watchman in the middle of the night, or they might attack him or threaten him. And the narrator describes how at least a few dozen of them were killed in the course of the plague. I think he says 18 to 20 at one point. But he also talks about how the best strategy was to stock up and lock up, to get a bunch of food and to shut yourself up in your house and never leave unless you had to. He writes, "Many families, foreseeing the approach of the distemper, laid up stores of provisions sufficient for their whole families and shut themselves up, and that so entirely that they were neither seen nor heard of till the infection was quite ceased, and then came abroad sound and well. I might recollect several such as these and give you the particulars of their management, for doubtless it was the most effectual, secure step that could be taken for such whose circumstances would not admit them to remove, or who had not retreats abroad proper for the case. For in being thus shut up, they were as if they had been 100 miles off. Nor do I remember that any one of those families miscarried. Among these, several Dutch merchants were particularly remarkable, who kept their houses like little garrisons besieged, suffering none to go in or out or come near them." End quote. This next passage describes the big pits into which the corpses were thrown, and something grim that some of the infected did. Quote, "It was about the 10th of September that my curiosity led, or rather drove me to go and see this pit again, when there had been near 400 people buried in it, and I was not content to see it in the daytime, as I had done before. For then there would have been nothing to have been seen but the loose earth, for all the bodies that were thrown in were immediately covered with earth by those they called the buriers, which at other times were called bearers. But I resolved to go in the night and see some of them thrown in. There was a strict order to prevent people coming to those pits, and that was only to prevent infection. But after some time that order was more necessary, for people that were infected and near their end and delirious also would run to those pits wrapped in blankets or rugs and throw themselves in, and, as they said, bury themselves. I cannot say that the officers suffered any willingly to lie there, but I have heard that in a great pit in Finsbury, in the parish of Cripplegate, it lying open then to the fields, for it was not then walled about, many came and threw themselves in and expired there, before they threw any earth upon them, and that when they came to bury others and found them there, they were quite dead, though not cold." End quote. He talks at one point about how richer people were able to lock themselves up in their houses because they could buy a bunch of food all at once and then not have to go out again. But poorer people didn't have that option because they didn't have enough money to buy a few months of food or the year's worth of food all at once. They had to earn money still somehow and then use it to buy their food for the week or whatever. Then he describes some of the precautions that people took when they went to the market, for example, and some of those also were really only available to rich people. It's interesting to see that they used vinegar to clean the coins that people would give them, since vinegar does kill bacteria, though I have no idea if it would have had any effect on that particular plague. He writes, quote, "It is true people used all possible precaution. When anyone bought a joint of meat in the market, they would not take it off the butcher's hand, but took it off the hooks themselves. On the other hand, the butcher would not touch the money, but have it put into a pot full of vinegar, which he kept for that purpose. The buyer carried always small money to make up any odd sum, that they might take no change. They carried bottles of scents and perfumes in their hands, and all the means that could be used were used. But then the poor could not do even these things, and they went at all hazards." End quote. The narrator is able to do this, and that maybe is part of why he survived, is he buys a bunch of food and shuts up his family. But the sentence where he describes that is interesting because he describes the hardship of living a few months without flesh meat. He's saying going for a few months without eating meat was a hardship. It was a difficulty. And this guy is a saddle manufacturer and merchant. So he's not a nobleman, but he's not a pauper either. He's not very poor. he's maybe an upper middle class guy, since he does have enough money to shut himself up. He doesn't consider himself one of the poor. And he knows how to write, which I think in the 1660s, maybe a bit more than a third of men in the UK would have known how to write. So he was probably upper middle class is one way to describe him. And going without meat was kind of a big deal. I like details like that because it tells us more realistically how things were in a particular place at a particular time in the past. We can sometimes develop a kind of cartoonish view of how bad things were in the past. We might exaggerate, for example, in the old days, you'd only have meat once a year for Christmas because it was so expensive. And here we have one account that tells us about how often he expected to eat meat, that to not eat it for a few months was going to be difficult. So that adds one little accurate detail to our portrait of daily life in 17th century London. He writes, quote, "As for my little family, having thus, as I have said, laid in a store of bread, butter, cheese, and beer, I took my friend and physician's advice and locked myself up and my family, and resolved to suffer the hardship of living a few months without flesh meat rather than to purchase it at the hazard of our lives." End quote. This next passage is a bit longer, but it's a story about a piper that's pretty funny. Quote, "It was under this John Hayward's care, and within his bounds, that the true story of the piper, with which people have made themselves so merry, happened, and he assured me that it was true. It is said that it was a blind piper, but as John told me, the fellow was not blind, but an ignorant, weak, poor man, and usually walked his rounds about 10 o'clock at night and went piping along from door to door, and the people usually took him in at public houses where they knew him, and would give him drink and victuals and sometimes farthings, and he in return would pipe and sing and talk simply, which diverted the people, and thus he lived. It was but a very bad time for this diversion, while things were as I have told, yet the poor fellow went about as usual, but was almost starved, and when anybody asked how he did, he would answer, the dead cart had not taken him yet, but that they had promised to call for him next week. It happened one night that this poor fellow, whether somebody had given him too much drink or no, John Hayward said he had not drink in his house, but that they had given him a little more victuals than ordinary at a public house in Coleman Street. And the poor fellow, having not usually had a bellyful for perhaps not a good while, was laid all along upon the top of a bulk or stall, and fast asleep at a door in the street near London Wall towards Cripplegate. And that upon the same bulk or stall the people of some house, in the alley of which the house was a corner, hearing a bell which they always rang before the cart came, had laid a body really dead of the plague just by him, thinking too that this poor fellow had been a dead body as the other was, and laid there by some of the neighbors. Accordingly, when John Hayward with his bell and the cart came along, finding two dead bodies lie upon the stall, they took them up with the instrument they used and threw them into the cart, and all this while the piper slept soundly. From hence they passed along and took in other dead bodies, till, as honest J. Hayward told me, they almost buried him alive in the cart, yet all this while he slept soundly. At length the cart came to the place where the bodies were to be thrown into the ground, which, as I do remember, was at Mount Mill. And as the cart usually stopped some time before they were ready to shoot out the melancholy load they had in it, as soon as the cart stopped, the fellow awaked and struggled a little to get his head out from among the dead bodies, when, raising himself up in the cart, he called out, "Hey, where am I?" This frighted the fellow that attended about the work, but after some pause, John Hayward, recovering himself, said, "Lord bless us, there's somebody in the cart not quite dead." So another called to him and said, "Who are you?" The fellow answered, "I am the poor piper. Where am I?" "Where are you?" says Hayward. "Why, you're in the dead cart, and we're going to bury you." "But I ain't dead though, am I?" says the piper, which made them laugh a little, though, as John said, they were heartily frighted at first. So they helped the poor fellow down, and he went about his business. I know the story goes he set up his pipes in the cart and frighted the bearers and others so that they ran away, but John Hayward did not tell the story so, nor say anything of his piping at all, but that he was a poor piper, and that he was carried away as above I am fully satisfied of the truth of. End quote. At one point he describes how the streets are so empty for so long that some of them start to have grass growing in them. I might be wrong, and this next passage might have been Daniel, but the earnestness with which he wishes that he could express what he remembered and what he heard makes me think that it was Henry, that this is somebody who really was recalling something that really deeply affected them, and they could still hear it in their ear, and they would want to be able to convey that to other people, but they feel helpless because they can't. He writes, quote, "It was indeed a lamentable thing to hear the miserable lamentations of poor dying creatures calling out for ministers to comfort them and pray with them, to counsel them and to direct them, calling out to God for pardon and mercy, and confessing aloud their past sins. It would make the stoutest heart bleed to hear how many warnings were then given by dying penitents to others not to put off and delay their repentance to the day of distress, that such a time of calamity as this was no time for repentance, was no time to call upon God. I wish I could repeat the very sound of those groans and of those exclamations that I heard from some poor dying creatures when in the height of their agonies and distress, and that I could make him that reads this hear, as I imagine I now hear them, for the sounds seem still to ring in my ears." End quote. This next section describes the desperation that people were in and the lengths to which it sometimes drove them. Quote, "Indeed, the distress of the people at this seafaring end of the town was very deplorable, and deserved the greatest commiseration. But alas, this was a time when everyone's private safety lay so near them that they had no room to pity the distresses of others, for everyone had death as it were at his door, and many even in their families, and knew not what to do or whither to fly. This, I say, took away all compassion. Self-preservation indeed appeared here to be the first law. For the children ran away from their parents as they languished in the utmost distress. And in some places, though not so frequent as the other, parents did the like to their children. Nay, some dreadful examples there were, and particularly 2 in 1 week, of distressed mothers, raving and distracted, killing their own children. One whereof was not far from where I dwelt. The poor lunatic creature not living herself long enough to be sensible of the sin of what she had done, much less to be punished for it." End quote. There are a few passages that talk about how the plague made people delirious, that as they got sick, they would run out in the street and act crazy, or even maybe try to give it to other people. And that's already a little strange, but you might imagine that in those days when they didn't feel like there was any help coming for them, people really might have just gone mad under the circumstances. But there's one passage in particular that if you read it the right way, this could be a passage to use in a zombie book or something, because it almost sounds like he's saying the sickness made people like rabid dogs and they wanted to go infect other people. Like it made them into aggressive zombies that started attacking each other. That's, of course, not what he's saying, but it's interesting how close this next passage comes to saying something like that. And remember, this is either Daniel or Henry Defoe writing about a plague in London in the late 17th century. He writes, quote, "Another thing might render the country more strict with respect to the citizens, and especially with respect to the poor. And this was what I hinted at before, namely that there was a seeming propensity or a wicked inclination in those that were infected to infect others. There have been great debates among our physicians as to the reason of this. Some will have it to be in the nature of the disease, and that it impresses everyone that is seized upon it with a kind of rage, and a hatred against their own kind, as if there was a malignity not only in the distemper to communicate itself, but in the very nature of man, prompting him with evil will or an evil eye, that as they say in the case of a mad dog, who though the gentlest creature before of any of his kind, yet then will fly upon and bite any one that comes next him, and those as soon as any who had been most observed by him before." End quote. And describing again how the streets and houses looked, physically all empty, and really try to imagine a street in 17th century London looking like this. He writes, quote, "Whole streets seemed to be desolated, and not to be shut up only, but to be emptied of their inhabitants. Doors were left open, windows stood shattering with the wind in empty houses for want of people to shut them." End quote. Describing the sores that were the sure sign of the plague, he writes, quote, "Many persons in the time of this visitation never perceived that they were infected till they found to their unspeakable surprise the tokens come out upon them, after which they seldom lived 6 hours, for those spots they called the tokens were really gangrene spots, or mortified flesh in small knobs as broad as a little silver penny, and hard as a piece of callus or horn, so that when the disease was come up to that length, there was nothing could follow but certain death. And yet, as I said, they knew nothing of their being infected, nor found themselves so much as out of order, till those mortal marks were upon them." End quote. In a passage I'm not going to read, he describes how some people would just drop dead in the marketplace, they didn't have any symptoms before, or they might have had these marks, but they were on their thighs and they hadn't noticed them, but they didn't feel sick, or they hadn't reported feeling sick, and they would just suddenly drop dead. In this next passage, he talks about how the international shipping was affected. And you'll notice initially he says the English ships would sometimes be accepted, but first all the cargo had to be aired out, an English ship. But if it was coming from London, nobody would take the ship at all under any circumstances. They didn't want anything from London. They might consider an English ship from somewhere else, but they didn't want a ship from London. But what's interesting is the Turkish port didn't have this strict policy. There was an example of a ship that went to Italy, they refused to receive it, and so then it went on to Turkey and had no problem unloading its goods. And this is a side note, but it's an example of a usage of a name. This writer, whether it's Henry writing in 1665 or Daniel writing in 1722 or so, uses the name Turkey. He's an English writer, this is not a translation. In his English, 300 years ago, he's using the name Turkey. Now, a lot of people will tell you that in those days it was called the Ottoman Empire, and that Turkey is the name that was given when it became the Republic of Turkey in 1923. And this was kind of a throwback to a pre-Islamic Turkish culture. And this is just one example showing how that's true and not true. The name Turkey must have been used to a certain extent. I don't know who called it the Ottoman Empire. That might be a name we gave it later. It was called the Sublime Porte a lot. But anyway, here's an English writer, 300 years ago at least, using the name Turkey to refer to that area. He writes, quote, "Our merchants were accordingly at a full stop. Their ships could go nowhere, that is to say, to no place around. Their manufactures and merchandise, that is to say, of our growth, would not be touched abroad. They were as much afraid of our goods as they were of our people, and indeed they had reason. For our woolen manufactures are as retentive of infection as human bodies, and if packed up by persons infected, would receive the infection and be as dangerous to touch as a man would be that was infected. And therefore, when any English vessel arrived in foreign countries, if they did take the goods on shore, they always caused the bales to be opened and aired in places appointed for that purpose. But from London, they would not suffer them to come into port, much less to unlade their goods upon any terms whatever, and this strictness was especially used with them in Spain and Italy. In Turkey, and the islands of the Arches indeed, as they are called, as well as those belonging to the Turks as to the Venetians, they were not so very rigid. In the first there was no obstruction at all, and 4 ships which were then in the river loading for Italy, that is, for Leghorn and Naples, being denied product as they call it, went on to Turkey, and were freely admitted to unlade their cargo without any difficulty." End quote. And he talks about the exaggerated reports of the effects of the plague that have reached other countries. I think that in other countries, people think that there's no one left alive in London, for example. And then he talks about how though those reports were untrue, they had a significant effect on the commerce. They made people afraid to take anything from England, and that this allowed the Flemings and the Dutch, particularly the Dutch, to take over English business. And he gives some detail about that. He writes, quote, "But these extravagant reports were very prejudicial to our trade, as well as unjust and injurious in themselves. For it was a long time after the plague was quite over before our trade could recover itself in those parts of the world. And the Flemings and Dutch, but especially the last, made very great advantages of it, having all the market to themselves, and even buying our manufactures in several parts of England where the plague was not, and carrying them to Holland and Flanders, and from thence transporting them to Spain and to Italy, as if they had been of their own making." End quote. In a couple places, he talks about the huge charity that went to supporting the poor people of London from other people within London and also people outside of London. There was a big effort to make sure that people had food to eat and things that they needed. And he's very proud of that. It was a great historical example of group solidarity and unity. He writes, quote, "This caused the multitude of single people in London to be unprovided for, as also families whose living depended upon the labor of the heads of those families. I say this reduced them to extreme misery, and I must confess it is for the honor of the city of London, and will be for many ages, as long as this is to be spoken of, that they were able to supply with charitable provision the wants of so many thousands of those as afterwards fell sick and were distressed, so that it may be safely averred that nobody perished for want, at least that the magistrates had any notice given them of." End quote. He says that there was no report of anyone having died of want. And this is in 17th century London, and it included a winter. Lots of people died of the plague. There are no reports of people having died of cold or hunger. So let that be for the honor of the city of London for many ages, as long as this is spoken of, as he says. As the plague is ending, people start to come back to the city. And among those who come back are clergy and doctors who had fled. He says the con men never come back. Many of them went out into the countryside to sell their snake oil there. Many of them died, but they didn't come back after the plague. Of the clergy and the doctors who left, he says a lot of them faced the odium of the people, and people would write on their doors notes to the extent that they had left during the plague. They had abandoned everyone. Because there were many clergy and doctors who stayed, and many of them died in the plague as a result. But the ones who left, people viewed them as having abandoned people when they most needed them. And the narrator is reflecting on this, and he has a little more sympathy for those guys, even though the narrator himself was in London for the entire duration of the plague. He writes, quote, "I recommend it to the charity of all good people to look back and reflect duly upon the terrors of the time, and whoever does so will see that it is not an ordinary strength that could support it. It was not like appearing in the head of an army or charging a body of horse in the field, but it was charging death itself on his pale horse. To stay was indeed to die," end quote. And again, as things are cooling off, people still want to try to purify their houses somehow. And there are various ways that people think that they can do this. And personally, I'm not so dismissive to think that none of these things that they did had any effect. I suspend judgment until somebody were to go down the list of each of these things that they did and say, no, that definitely wouldn't do anything. This wouldn't do anything. Because while it's more likely that these traditional remedies probably didn't have any effect, some of them might have. For example, the thing about vinegar. Vinegar does kill bacteria. I don't know what effect it would have on a plague. But you'll see in this next passage, there were certain practices for purifying the house that maybe purified it a bit too much. Quote, "However, in general, prudent, cautious people did enter into some measures for airing and sweetening their houses, and burned perfumes, incense, benjamin, rosin, and sulfur in their rooms close shut up, and then let the air carry it all out with a blast of gunpowder. Others caused large fires to be made all day and all night for several days and nights, by the same token that 2 or 3 were pleased to set their houses on fire, and so effectually sweetened them by burning them down to the ground. As particularly one at Ratcliffe, one in Holborn, and one at Westminster, besides 2 or 3 that were set on fire. But the fire was happily got out again before it went far enough to burn down the houses. And one citizen's servant, I think it was in Thames Street, carried so much gunpowder into his master's house for clearing it of the infection, and managed it so foolishly that he blew up part of the roof of the house." End quote. And to end on a high note, this last passage is from when people got a weekly report of the deaths. These reports were given weekly. One of them reported that the deaths had significantly decreased, and this was a sign that the plague was waning. Quote, "It is impossible to express the change that appeared in the very countenances of the people that Thursday morning when the weekly bill came out. It might have been perceived in their countenances that a secret surprise and smile of joy sat on everybody's face. They shook one another by the hands in the streets, who would hardly go on the same side of the way with one another before. Where the streets were not too broad, they would open their windows and call from one house to another and ask how they did, and if they had heard the good news that the plague was abated. Some would return when they said good news and ask, what good news? And when they answered that the plague was abated and the bills decreased almost 2,000, they would cry out, God be praised, and would weep aloud for joy, telling them they had heard nothing of it. And such was the joy of the people that it was, as it were, life to them from the grave. I could almost set down as many extravagant things done in the excess of their joy as of their grief, but that would be to lessen the value of it." End quote. And those are the passages that I wanted to show you from A Journal of the Plague Year by Daniel Defoe. It's worth remembering this plague that for 18 months in 1665 and 1666 more than decimated London. To decimate is to take 1/10 of something. Decit. This plague quadrated London. It killed 100,000 people, being a quarter of the population of the city. And we could make comparisons and say, only so many soldiers were killed in such and such a war, and we remember that so much, and there's so many movies made about it. And to a certain extent, wars are remembered because remembering a war has a present value. You're looking at history, but often you are telling a modern story about it. You're saying this is a good war and therefore we ought to do this and this thing in the modern day. Or that was a bad war and so we should do this thing today. What's bewildering, what makes us wild about natural disasters in general and a plague in particular is that you can't really tell such a story about it. It's just a natural disaster. It's a disaster that comes from nature. The plague doesn't benefit by killing us. You can't tell a story about how greedy it is or how it's trying to conquer our land as you would in a war against France or whatever. It's just killing you for no reason and you don't know how. So I think wars are remembered more than things like plagues, though plagues are often more destructive because it's hard to talk about them and it's hard to think about them. There's no story to tell about a plague. It's just nature sending a blind, gluttonous death. And it's not only coming for soldiers and it's not only coming for men. It's coming for everybody. And I think that's part of why a plague provokes, as we see in Defoe's descriptions here, all of the madness that it does. And I didn't even read all the passages that I could have about that. So now if you're ever reading about the late 17th century or Isaac Newton or plagues in general, you can remember the plague that hit London in 1665 and 1666. And if we take a simplified, immature, truly unrealistic view of history, then this event is just a little footnote that doesn't really affect us very much. But this was something that killed 100,000 people, significantly affected what was going on in the rest of Europe for a couple years, and I'm sure it took a while for London to fully recover. And the fact that much of this sounds so familiar should tell us that technology changes, but human nature doesn't change very much. And all of the lessons that we can draw from Defoe's writing will remain relevant for the next time we have to deal with something like this. If you enjoyed listening to this podcast, I hope you'll go over to my website, vollrathpublishing.com. That's VOLLRATH publishing.com. And pick up some books for yourself, for your family, for your friends. I've prepared an edition of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein with original cover art and 97 footnotes that describe some of the more unusual terms and references in the text. It's excellent print quality. I have it at a good price with free shipping. I'm very pleased with how it came out. If you haven't read Frankenstein, you absolutely should. If you have read it, you should get it for somebody that you know. It's as relevant as it ever was, and it's good both for people who read old books regularly and also for people maybe who are not quite as used to reading an old book. It's a good introduction to classic literature. It's not very long. It's action-packed. It's got a lot to think about, a lot to talk about. I truly believe that every thinking person should have a copy of Frankenstein on their bookshelf. And since I prepared the book myself, I have the luxury of selling something not because it's my job to sell it, but I prepared it because I believe that it's something that people should have. I wasn't given a thing and told, tell people why they need this. I first made a thing that I think people need, and now I'm trying to get it to you. Which in business, that's a decadent luxury that I've never experienced before. To be selling something that I absolutely, truly, completely believe in, as I do for Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. And the good news is going forward, I only ever have to publish books that I want to publish. So that will be true for the next book I publish also. Anyway, thank you so much for listening to this. I put a lot of work into these, but I love doing it. And I'm glad to know that there are some other people who enjoy listening to them also. I hope you're doing well. Farewell until next time. Take care and happy reading.